two interventions. The first one will be given by Ilaria Ventura Bordenca. She's based at the University of Palermo. Amongst her publications, Food Packing, Narrazioni semiotiche e Branding alimentare, Essere a diete, regimi alimentari e stili di vita, and many others. Today, the title of today's paper is Free from the Rise and Fall of Sugar in Contemporary Dietetics. Please.
Okay. Thank you, Gabriele. Thank you very much, Nicola Perullo, for organizing this symposium. I thank you also, Maddalena Borsato, for the organizational details. And I'm very pleased and honored also to, in this occasion, have known the possibility, the opportunity to know Professor Stephen Shapin, whose works have inspired parts of my works on the semiotics of dietetics. Okay, the question of my presentation regards mainly communication of food, or if you prefer, history of food communication. In particular, the communicative transformation of sugar in contemporary food culture. I've asked myself, when and how did sugar become a sort of villain of our food imagery? It's well known that today many industrial food products are sold as sugar-free. Biscuits, candies, drinks, snacks, even medications. And the well-known problem is that of the excess of calories and of the related diseases, all issues that concern at the same time health, society, science, and education. Also, markets that were previously unaffected by this type of phenomenon have been involved. Non-alcoholic wines and spirits today are sold with low level of sugar or are sugar-free. So there's a sort of sugar-free option for all occasions. This massive elimination of sugar responds to a more general trend towards the free-from food. It's a typical trend of our food culture and affects industrial products in particular. They are too processed, too full of fats, sugar, salt, and other ingredients that are considered harmful to health. An idea of health and of illness and of what is considered toxic food and healthy food that comes from the affirmation of nutritionism and scientism in general that brought to a quantitative idea of food as a sum of nutrients and calories, a story that Stephen Shapin describes perfectly in his various works, also Eating and Being. So today, food product communication is characterized from more by highlighting what products do not contain than what they do contain. Just have a look at the supermarket, at the labels of packaging and advertising campaigns, and you can see that labels have become a list of things that are not there. There's a sort of rhetoric of the free-from that's a widespread and repeated way of describing food, which applies not only to single products, but also to entire brands that carry this positive value of the absence in their name. And this free-from rhetoric is a form of narration of food that is quite the opposite of what happened until the 60s, the 70s, in Italy also 80s, 90s, where industrial foods were presented and promoted as better than homemade and natural foods. Moreover, in those years, industrial foods were sold with the addition of something, vitamins, sugar, gluten, milk, and quite the contrary of the current free-from. In Semiotica del Gusto, Gianfranco Marrone has defined these two historical trends, this of the adding to and that of the removing from food, as very food ideologies, since they create cultural tensions and guide consumers' choices at the supermarket. Although there are differences, both these ideologies are the result of this common nutritionist approach. And both of them, of course, are fueled by brand advertising that takes them, amplifies them, making them real for people. It's, of course, a typical brand strategy. In order to survive, brands always take the main dominant cultural tensions and amplify and use them. Also, the broth was better. The industrial broth was better than homemade broth in the 60s. So, given this cultural and communicative context, what about sugar? How is it presented in this current dominant free-from rhetoric? The next part of my presentation will be organized as follows. First, I will briefly discuss the historical transformations in the uses and meanings of sugar, linking them to the different dietetic philosophies illustrated by Shapin. So I apologize all the historians here for any mistakes, inaccuracies. I'm a semioticist. And in the second part, I will give you some examples of how in Western mediatic discourse, the absence of sugar is described and put in value. And I will take some examples from US market and also Italian market for some biographical reasons, so to speak. The basic hypothesis is that behind the reductionist conception of food as a sum of calories and nutrients, from which the demonization of sugar comes, new forms of consumption and therefore of living a being are emerging. In the relation between eating and being, the word "and" is understood, in my opinion, as a relation of signification, of course. So eating means being, and also because eating is not only what we put in the plate, but also we choose not to put in our plate. So being is the sort of effect of meaning, a content of our choices. Okay, long before it became an enemy of our contemporary food culture, sugar was considered a celestial delight for few privileged rich people. Also because in the history of food, taste had a functional purpose. The sweet taste was considered as a sign of nutritional qualities of the meal, according to the Latin motto, quod sapit nutrit. Sweetness was a good indicator of the goodness of the dish, and in the same logic, bitterness, on the other hand, was a sign of potentially harmful foods. Professor Massimo Montanari in Amaro talks also about this. However, although this general positive disposition, ancient disposition towards sweet taste, the fear of sugar is not just a contemporary phenomenon. In this regard, Claude Fischler highlights the dual view of sugar that has characterized food history, and he speaks of saccharophilia and saccharophobia. The former was primarily linked to the pleasure of the taste of sweetness, as I mentioned, but also to the fact that it was used as medicine. It was a pharmacon. Sugar was good because it was curative, it calmed inflammation, was excellent for lungs and digestive system, and so on. Before being used as food, sugar was used for various purposes, all very different from today's uses. Sidney Mintz, in his History of Sugar, Sweetness and Power, lists 4 uses of sugar. One was the medical one, I just mentioned. The second was its use as a spice. The third as a food preservative, as a decorative material for the table of rich people, and only finally as a sweetener for food and drinks. On the side of saccharophobia, Fischler, but also Shapin, recall how there were detractors of sugar even in ancient times. Like any pharmacon, too much sugar would be poisonous, but above all, according to Fischler, the negative perception of sugar was fundamentally linked to moral issues, depending on the pleasure of the sweet taste. Its delicious and irresistible flavor had to be kept under control. Sugar was too good, so its consumption had to be moderated like any other aphrodisiac. As Shapin often says, dietetic, and he also said this a few minutes ago, dietetics has the social role of regulating the tension between morality and pleasure. There was also a problem of ambiguity surrounding sugar itself. Being food, spice, pharmacon, all at once, it had an ambivalent status that partly excluded it from being food. For example, it could be used as an appetite regulator during the religious abstinence, also in Christianity. So this ambivalence made it unclassifiable, non-nutritious, for pleasure. Sugar was therefore potentially dangerous. So, like anthropology and history of food have demonstrated, saccharophobia and saccharophilia have therefore always existed, since they are deep negative or positive forms of evaluation of food that are embedded in different historical and cultural contexts that are based on specific ideas of medicine, body, nutrition, dietetics, and morality. In this regard, as Shapin writes, there's a fundamental difference in the relation between eating and being as it was understood in ancient modern times, and today he has called it back at the beginning of the conference. And I will sum up very quickly. In dietetic of the past, what was good to eat was what was good for one's body, what agrees with one's body and habits. So food is good if it's good for you, according to the idea of the four elements, the four qualities, which corresponded to the four humors and the relative human types, with their personal and social identities, the choleric, the sanguine, the melancholic, phlegmatic, and so on. Humoral temperament, the complexion, was both physical and psychological and behavioral. According to this dietetic philosophy, it was necessary to eat foods whose quality was similar to one's own qualities, and only in case of disequilibrium, eating food of the opposite types. Sugar, for instance, was classified as hot and moist, and so it was perfect in case of too much dryness of the body. With contemporary nutritionist-oriented dietetics, this relationship between being and eating, between the human subject and the eaten object, the food eaten has changed. What is good is not given by the relation between the two, but it's good what is good from a biochemical point of view. Both these two dietetic philosophies are the expressions of broader classifications and broader idea of the world, of the body, of the relations between the two. They depend on forms of shaping the relations between the heterogeneous elements of the collective, human and non-human subjects and food subjects and foodstuffs in general. We could refer to the anthropologist Philippe Descola and his famous four ontologies that account for the different ways of composing collectives. As is well known, Descola identifies four different ways of composing societies depending on how they conceive the relations between humans and non-humans in terms of similarity or difference between the physicality, what he calls exteriority, in general what is called as nature, to simplify, and spirit, consciousness, behavior, the interiority. We could then advance that idea of different dietetic ontologies based on how the relationship between the eating body, the human subject, and the eaten, ingested object, non-human element is understood. So trying to connect this is the historical perspective of Shapin with this anthropological perspective. And we could thus say that today's dietetics is an ontologically naturalistic dietetic based on physical continuity. Food is something that, when ingested, changes our body, that is, broadly speaking, a common basis for humanity, but there's a discontinuity of interiority, so food is only physiology and biochemistry, and it cannot in any way contribute to the subject personality, identity, mood. Food has nothing to do with temperament. The idea of temperament doesn't exist. The ancient and modern dietetics, on the other hand, is based on the idea of the homology. So it belongs to analogist, to analogism. The ontology of analogism is the philosophy of similarity that was very typical of ancient and modern Western culture, based on the search of harmony between elements of the cosmos and nature that are given as different from each other. As the scholar himself says, categories such as hot, cold, dry, and moist are ways used to classify and interconnect things that are totally different from each other. But we could dare to assume that in humoral dietetics, this similarity between the eaten object and the eating and being, between the subject and the object, is so great that it stresses the relation towards what we might call an almost totemist ontology, in which the eaten subject and the eaten object resemble each other a lot because they belong to a sort of common class that they manifest. Food modify and build the human body, but also it creates a human temperament according to the four elements and the four basic qualities. They both belong to the human and the food. A logic that is also applied at cultural and geographical groups. If you knew what the English, the Arabs, or French ate, you knew also how they would behave, also Shapin says. So, if the dietetics of the past is fundamental, so the nutritionism belonged to a sort of naturalist dietetic, the humoral medicine, humoral dietetic is an analogist dietetic that shifts in its effect to a totemist dietetic. Of course, these are dominant tendencies. They are not separated schemes. I'm well aware for this because forms of analogical way of reasoning we also can find in the nutritionist way of thinking. Just think on milk that was sold as something that reinforce bones also because they share the same quality, the same white color, for instance, is an analogical view of the same problem. Okay. Up to now, we have taken for granted the overlap between sugar and sweet taste. Obviously, this is not the case because various types of sweeteners have always existed in the history of food before sugar. Just think of honey, of course. But I mention this because the issue of sweetness is important in understanding the massification of sugar and thus its gradual villainization. A return to Sidney Mintz, who questions how sugar, from being something for very few, became a mass product food in the 20th century. And he identifies, I go very, very quickly, he identifies three phases in the development of sugar consumption in Europe. Up to the 70s, rarity with mainly non-food uses, up to the 80s, luxury food, and from the 18th and 20th century, a food necessity. In particular, Mintz takes into account the culinary habits of England between the 18th and the 20th century, and he argues that some specific beverages, such as coffee, chocolates, and above all, of course, tea, played a fundamental role in spreading sugar for food use. Chocolate, coffee, tea are all bitter and stimulating beverages on which sugar has the role to sweetening and domesticating the bitterness. In England, in particular, sugar became popular in tea with biscuits, sweetened tea served with other sweet baked food, such as biscuits, puddings, cakes, and so on. And it became a new taste unit that became soon a meal for the poorer classes. It was low-cost calorie, very fast and low-cost calories. But it soon became, it soon became also the perfect work break, so the break of the working classes, but it was also immediately filled with symbolic meaning, so it became a rituality also. Mary Douglas, in The Ciphering Meal, talks about this symbolic role of the tea with biscuits in synthesizing an entire meal richer and therefore inaccessible for poor people. Okay, this functional valorization of sugar as tasteful, fast, and low-cost calories for the masses allowed the saccharophilia to spread in Europe and USA and appeared, of course, in advertising, okay, with the mythology of the energy, okay? So sugar was food energy. It nourishes, it gives you energy, especially for children that were the main protagonists of this advertisement. As a consequence of this massification of sugar, new gastronomic cultures and collective aesthetics spread as well. English people preferred sweetened food, modern French, and so on, more accustomed to bitterness of wine and so on. So from this point of view, also this functional valorization have aesthetic and cultural effects because it creates test trends, rituals, dominant collective ways of consumption and being. From another perspective, different from the historical one, but very near, the semiologist Roland Barthes, in the 50s, when the good promotion of sugar was at its peak, like this, began studying food. Barthes considered food as one of the contemporary mythologies of the middle class, so obvious things in everyday life, but precisely for this reason to be necessary to be decoded and to be understood. In a seminal essay on contemporary food published in 1961, Barthes talked about sugar, and in particular he used the expression sugar time. He recognizes typical of American society of the 50s, and he uses the word time to refer not to an ingredient or to a single taste, but to an attitude, to a category of time, a category of thought, we can say, a way of consumption, of living and spending time, a way of eating and being. Barthes frames the issue of food and consumption in terms of what we might call a semiotics of culture. So for Barthes, what is interesting is not taste in itself, but what it means and how it is connected with other cultural categories. Okay, so if this is the positive story of sugar, when did its decline begin? Or how did food communication portray its negative valorization transformation? It's a story that began in the United States in the 50s, of course during this peak of the sugar time, with a specific product, the soft drinks. The elimination of sugar started from there. The first sugar-free products were drinks like soda and colas that were produced for diabetic people or for people, mainly women at the time, who were interested in counting calories. So there was dozens of soft drinks without sugar or with only 1 calorie, like the no-cal in 1852, the Diet Right Cola in 1958, and then there was the Tab, that was by Coca-Cola Company. It was the first of the Coca-Cola Company, but without the brand Coca-Cola. I think that the name says it all because keep on tab means counting calories, tracking the calories. And in 1982, perhaps the most famous arrives, that is the Diet Coke. Today, Diet Coke is a brand in its own, and there are also it's not the only 1 calorie drink of Coca-Cola, because there are also the Coca-Cola Zero Sugar, and the difference is in the type of sweetener that takes the place of sugar. And so they produces different type of sweetness. I'll be back to the sweetener in a moment. Okay, it's interesting to note that Coca-Cola and its similar competitors are also bitter energy drinks, like coffee, chocolate, and tea. So there's an interesting parallelism with the beverage means mentioned in the history of sugar. I think we all remember that Coca-Cola was, as its very first, a restorative drink for intellectual workers, or for students, or a remedy for headache. After sugary drinks, the sugar-free trend has invested other markets, beverages, chewing gum, candies, chocolate, snacks. It's interesting that they were all sweet things that were not strictly food, but always things around the meal, like drinks, or outside the meal, candies, sweets, and so on. It's a typical logic of the diet, that of imposing conditions. So it's allowed to consumption, to eat sweets and small extra meal pleasures only on condition that they do not produce too many calories. Okay. It's not the case that during the boom of these dietetic drinks, also generic campaign defending the use of sugar appear in the 60s, in the 70s, and also later. And they are aimed at all adult audience, but also to children. And it's interesting because here, sugar is presented as an appetite regulator, like in ancient times. And also here, for the children, sugary foods are good because they are sweet. So the idea that the sweet taste is good, so it's good to eat. Also in Italy we had our generic campaign promoting sugar. So I think that this campaign, where there's such a type of campaign, it's the official sign that the sugar is an enemy. Because if someone had to say that something is good, is maybe because there are other persons who think quite the contrary. Okay, 5 minutes left? Yeah. Okay. Okay, going towards the end of this presentation, I would like to say something about this current communication of this free-from rhetoric, considering with you some examples. First of all, the word used in advertising or in packaging, free from, the tag free from is a simple tag that actually is a narration, because it tells the story of the elimination of an enemy, the elimination and the valorization of something that is not good, that is an enemy, a villain. In addition to the tag free from, there is a very large of the use of zero. There's this current passion for the zero word that it's interesting because it tells the story of how the non-value par excellence, the zero, that means nothing, emptiness, absence, but also negative sanction. In Italian, tu sei uno zero, it's a terrible judgment. Also zero in the school, it's terrible. In the end, if what I've just said is referred to the syntagmatic level, so the combination of free from, zero with the specific ingredients, is also worth considering the paradigmatic level, so all the other types of sugar that can replace it to sweeten food. New heroes, the sugar with a low caloric impact. For some time now, many alternatives to sugar have been added alongside refined white granulated sugar. We have cane sugar, cane sugar, raw or whole cane sugar, coconut sugar, grape juice, various syrups, honey, and other sweeteners such as aspartame, erythritol, sorbitol, xylitol. Each of these sweeteners is different because it makes a promise to the consumer in terms of calorie content, sweetness, texture, taste, aesthetic experience, similarity to the white sugar. Some of them emphasize the fact that they are crunchy like granulated sugar, but also other values like the naturality that is conveyed by the imperfection of the brown sugar compared to the white, optical white perfection of white sugar. But there is also a difference in materiality. We have liquid drops, tablets of sugar, an interesting medicalization, or aesthetic of medicalization of sugar. Not to mention that these sweeteners are claimed to be suitable for different types of diets, sugar for vegan, for ketogenic diet, for gluten-free diet, and so on. So, there's a real competitive market among sugar alternatives, with each seeking a specific positioning as a product. And it's a sector that has received little attention today, but that can be explored more. I'll just give you some examples of some advertising campaign to conclude of a few international brands, just to give you an idea of the variety of the phenomenon. This Pure Via that focuses on naturalness, but also in its suitability for all the diets, and also for the similarity to the sugar that became sort of model, but just on the sensorial level. Splenda, that focuses on the American origin of its stevia, so giving stevia a national political value. Truvia, the more ironic, okay, of the use of being sugar-free. And Equal, as the name suggests, focuses on the perfect equivalence with sugar for all situations. So, all things considered, it seems to me that the taste of sweetness in the hyper-health conscious world we live in is trying to rethink itself by producing new sweet flavors, new ways of sweetening that correspond and create, at the same time, different lifestyles and value system, the natural sugar, the vegan sugar, the politically correct sugar, and so on. So the naturalistic ontology cannot escape the production of meaning. On the contrary, just because it predicts the principle of reductionism, it produces an overflowing symbolism. It needs to create many meanings, differentiate, articulate itself. Although the direction between eating and being has been reversed, so that what is good in itself, it's precisely the advertising and media universe that relaunches subjectivities, pluralities, constantly proposing new ways of consuming, tasting, cooking, eating, and thus signifying many new, always new ways of eating and being. And that's it, I've finished. Thank you. Scusa Gabriele, sono andata fuori di 3 minuti.
Thank you so much, Ilaria, for this semiotic view and analysis of the history of sugar in recent times. Between saccharophilia and saccharophobia, in my opinion, also it's really important to analyze meanings attributed to sugar, as you said. But after I have some questions for you. Right now I move to the next speaker and introduce her, who is Lisa Haushofer. Is assistant professor of food history at the University of Amsterdam. Her work is located at the intersection of the history of medicine, science, and food. Her book, Wonder Foods, in my opinion, it's really... The title of her intervention is Recent Retellings, so starting from the closing remarks of the volume, the New Nutrition Science Project, and Moral Expertise over Nutrition. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I want to also start by thanking the organizers for including me in this conference. I'm truly grateful to be part of a forum that honors this remarkable book and the work of a scholar who I've been lucky to call a mentor and who I think is as brilliant as he is generous, and I suspect is going to absolutely detest being the center of so much praise and attention, but it's only right. I'm also very grateful because the anxiety over whether I'd be able to do this task justice has helped me lose weight, something very hard to do when you're a foodie, and has distracted me from the deplorable state of the world this past year. So thank you for that also. When I was a graduate student making my first tentative attempts to write about the history of nutrition, it was transformative for me to encounter a scholar who was unapologetic about the fact that food was something to be taken seriously in the history of science, that it was not a marginal or decorative, but a central category through which human subjectivity is constructed and through which regimes of knowledge production can be grasped. The momentous research that went into eating and being articulates a profound transformation in one of the most pressing quotidian concerns of our lives, the relationship to food. That transformation, the book shows, affected how we inhabit our bodies, how we make sense of the world, and how we conceive of our own and others' goodness and worthiness in it. I think the magnitude of this transformation cannot be overstated. And at the same time, eating and being is perhaps even more a story of continuity than of change. It shows the non-radical nature of the transformation from dietetics to nutrition science between the 18th and 19th centuries, the lingering of notions of moderation and balance, the absorption of dietetic vocabulary and sensory references within mechanical and chemical reformist programs, and the persistence of moral imperatives of eating. Whether the emphasis is on continuity or change, the historical dimension of what and how we eat has often been left out of contemporary commentary on food. And yet, as the book points out, it does live in our collective imagination. In its conclusion, the book addresses recent retellings of the historical progression of our relationship to food and shows how such retellings have been used to either celebrate narratives of progress or lament a paradise lost. So in my remaining time today, I'd like to reflect with you on one such retelling of the history of dietetics and nutrition science, one that originated within the nutrition science community in the early 2000s. It's a historical narrative, so fast food, propagated by the architects of the so-called New Nutrition Science Project and the proclaimers of the associated Gießen Declaration. The New Nutrition Science Project was an international consortium of researchers who sought to reform the nutrition sciences from within in a perceived moment of crisis. The diagnosis of the problem and the identification of the solution rested on a historical narrative which combined assertions of progress and warnings of decline. It celebrated the founding of nutrition science in the 19th century as a biomedical science, but warned that this biomedical enterprise had lost the social and environmental dimensions of traditional dietetics. These social and environmental dimensions now needed to be reintegrated into nutrition science to make it fit for the challenges of the 21st century. And as a historian of science and food, I'm interested in what this narrative can tell us about how the production of nutritional knowledge was imagined and organized around the turn of the century in the nutrition sciences. So I'd like to take you through the emergence and the context of the New Nutrition Science Project and the Gießen Declaration, then identify the kinds of historical retellings it relied on, and finally reflect with you on the implications of these retellings for the history of nutrition and for the production of nutritional knowledge today. So the New Nutrition Science Project was an international endeavor, but it was strongly steered by two people, German nutrition scientist Klaus Leitzmann and British journalist Geoffrey Cannon. Both of these figures are important to understand the emergence of the project more broadly and place it within its historical context. Klaus Leitzmann came to the New Nutrition Science Project primarily through his role in the establishment of nutritional ecology as a university discipline in Germany during the second half of the 20th century. In the 1970s, a group of students at the University of Gießen had formed an alternative food working group under the leadership of a student of nutrition named Karl von Körber, which included Leitzmann. The group's founding reflected the concerns of the German environmental movement, the formation of the German Green Party, as well as global development politics and the world hunger crisis in 1974, which received extensive media coverage in Germany. As Corinna Treitel has shown, this was the period when food was environmentalized in Germany, and eating natural evolved from its fascist roots to become mainstream and increasingly left-wing in German academia and politics. The group around Körber discussed alternative ways of eating, as well as social and ecological questions related to nutrition. Based on the group, Körber and Leitzman together published a book on full-value nutrition, a popular German concept at the time designating healthy, organic, and ethically produced food in 1981. Körber and Leitzman also petitioned for a university chair in nutritional ecology, and after several setbacks, such a chair was successfully established at Gießen in 2001 and filled with Ingrid Hoffmann, one of only 3 women signers of the Gießen Declaration. And several other signers also had ties to Gießen. By contrast, Geoffrey Cannon came to the New Nutrition Science Project primarily through his role in state nutritional policy and his long-standing criticism of the relationship between food, science, industry, and government. Cannon was not a nutrition scientist by training, but initially a music critic and then a journalist of health and fitness. In this capacity, he covered the delayed release of the 1983 British Nutrition and Health Report and wrote critical exposés of the food industry. He founded the British National Food Alliance, which connected British organizations concerned with food and farming. This earned him a role as civil society member of the UK government delegation to the 1992 joint WHO and FAO International Conference on Nutrition. In 2000, he moved to Brazil and there consulted on matters of health and nutrition with the Brazilian government. He played an important role in the drafting of the 2001 Brazilian dietary guidelines and would later become an influential figure in the development of the NOVA classification, which famously was one of the first classifications to take notions of food processing into account. In 2000, Cannon, together with, as he put it, a few of his friends, launched the so-called World Health Policy Forum, which was one of the main organizers of the New Nutrition Science Project. It embodied the belief that nutrition policy had failed to adapt to a rapidly changing world and that a more flexible approach was needed that would be independent of governments, international agencies, and special interests. Several members of the World Health Policy Forum were signers of the Gießen Declaration. And then finally, the New Nutrition Science Project also evolved from the legacy of mid-20th century attempts to internationalize nutritional research. The Gießen Declaration was partly initiated by the International Union of Nutritional Sciences, an organization formed in 1946 under the leadership of the British Nutrition Society. The aims of the IUNS were to exchange information between nutrition researchers, organize international conferences, and publish the results of nutritional scientific investigations. Despite the largely homogeneous composition of the New Nutrition Science Project, the signers of the Gießen Declaration stressed the international character of their endeavor. For example, Leitzman and Cannon, in an editorial, underlined the significance of the declaration coinciding with the first International Nutrition Congress to be held on the African continent. And the president of the IUNS, Mark Wahlquist, underscored his own multinational history, as well as the history of his predecessor and another signer of the declaration, Ricardo Uwai, a Chilean citizen with ties to the Eastern Mediterranean, Latin America, and Europe. The Gießen meeting therefore also included a few officials from international organizations such as the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the Food and Agricultural Organization. So this historical background of emerging environmental consciousness, evolving national and international health policy, and growing critiques of the relationship between nutrition science, state, and industry can help us situate the emergence of the New Nutrition Science Project in its historical moment. But its foundation was also a rather self-conscious attempt by its founders to insert themselves actively into the history of nutrition and to intervene in the course of nutrition science history. The project was launched at a workshop held at the University of Gießen's Schloss Rauschholzhausen in 2005. The attendees of the workshop were mostly nutrition scientists. So here's a list with all participants with a nutritional scientific background. But there was also a professional historian, Uwe Spiekermann, who had written about the rise of a nutrient-centric nutrition science in the 19th century. Spiekermann's inclusion suggests an openness to history, but also, I think, a certain deliberateness in documenting the conference as a historically significant moment. The workshop participants presented traditional papers and plenaries over several days, but also gathered in small breakout groups to draft and revise, sometimes overnight, a declaration based on their common vision for nutrition science. The signing of the declaration took place in the Justus von Liebig Museum in Gießen, and that's no coincidence, I think. The New Nutrition Science Project relied on a particular retelling of the history of nutrition where Liebig and his scientific approach to nutrition constituted a major turning point. To the architects of the New Nutrition Science Project, Liebig signified the emergence of what they referred to as classical nutrition science. In a special issue that announced and accompanied the signing of the declaration, Cannon and Leitzman declared that the investigation of nutrition had been founded as a biochemical science in the century between 1850 and 1950, and that this had happened primarily through the work of Liebig. Classical nutrition science was characterized by its quantitative and experimental approach, its grounding in the natural scientific disciplines of chemistry and physiology, and its successes in identifying major components of the nutritional process, such as the macronutrients and their supposed purposes in nutrition. The author's stance towards classical nutrition science was not uncritical. They conceded that classical nutrition science was a reductionist form of investigation, one that was tied to a mechanistic view of the body and was conducted primarily by scientists with physiological, chemical, or medical training. As a result, it reduced food to its chemical constituents and failed to consider the broader social and ecological implications of nutrition. But at the same time, the pages of the special issue were infused with a degree of nostalgia about the scientific character of the enterprise and the supposed influence of classical nutrition science. This influence, the authors imagined, was not only due to the convincing nature of the science itself, but also the charisma of the prominent nutrition scientists who had been able to harness their science for political influence and had become what Cannon and Leitzman described as powers behind the throne. The signers of the declaration imagined the history of classical nutrition science as a lineage of charismatic nutrition scientists, all male, white, and from the global north, who had carried on Liebig's work and influence, from Max von Pettenkofer and Wilbur Atwater to Elmer McCollum and Robert McCance. And this may come across as a little nitpicky, but just to show you the degree to which this lineage was imagined as male, the authorship of the chemical composition of foods, which was co-authored by Robert McCance and Elsie Widdowson, is stated as Robert McCance with Elsie Widdowson and assistants. And I think that's quite telling in this context, at least. It is this emphasis on the big personalities of nutrition science that was reflected in the choice of venue for the signing of the Gießen Declaration. And it is likely that the signers imagined themselves as continuing this lineage. Cannon, in particular, had a conception of the history of successful nutrition science as a history of the movers and shakers, and he identified strongly with historical and contemporary figures whom he regarded as influential but independent. Cannon's self-described hero was Rudolf Virchow, whom he associated with both rigorous science and social consciousness, and with a penchant for talking back to power. Cannon drew a direct parallel between Virchow and Derek Jack, a WHO director responsible for the prevention of chronic disease, including by food and nutrition. To Canon, Jack was a model of charisma, glamour, and informality, and he referred to Jack as our hero with the JFK touch. However, in 2005, Jack left the WHO in order to take a position at PepsiCo, a decision Canon criticized repeatedly and vocally in the World Policy Forum blog. To Canon, Jack's conduct was a betrayal of an independent nutrition science and a symptom of the alarming decline of nutrition as a science in the 20th century. So as much as Canon and Leitzman and the signers of the Declaration admired classical nutrition science, they also declared that something had been lost in the 19th century. They contrasted classical biomedical nutrition science with its predecessor, pre-modern dietetics. When nutrition science was reductionist, dietetics was a holistic philosophy of life with a long, distinctly Western tradition. Its origins could be traced back through the European Renaissance to antiquity and all the way back to the first records in Egypt 6,000 years ago. It was concerned with the relationship of foods and drinks with the health of humans within society and nature. This broad conception of diet, meaning way of life, was complemented by a broad conception of health, for which Canon and Leitzman used language reminiscent of the WHO definition of health as encompassing mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, and not just physical health or the mere absence of disease. In a historical overview within the special issue titled The Rise and Fall of Dietetics and of Nutrition Science, Canon also stressed the ecological dimensions of dietetics and underlined its cosmological conception of health and the great chain of being. In the 21st century, nutrition science was in crisis not only because its scientists had lost prestige and status, but because its biological nature and reductionism had run up against a changed world that required a broader approach. Canon and Leitzman referred to this double decline of nutrition as the gorilla in the room. Everybody in the nutrition science community was aware of it, but nobody dared to address it. The task of the New Nutrition Science Project was now to counteract this decline, to revive classical nutrition science and reunite it with some aspects of dietetics. So how was this transformation to be accomplished? According to the signers of the Gießen Declaration, the new nutrition would remain a biological science, but would also become a social and environmental science. But what this meant exactly was unclear. The degree to which nutrition scientists were either to collaborate with social and environmental scientists, to integrate social and environmental science methodology, or to simply take social and environmental dimensions into account was never clearly spelled out in the special issue. Instead, the commentary on the Declaration reveals a set of troubling underlying assumptions concerning the relationship between these disciplines that, as a historian of science, I find extremely interesting and was keen to make sense of. Most telling, I thought, were references to classical biomedical nutrition science as a hard science, which implied that non-biomedical approaches to nutrition were soft, with all the troublesome hierarchical and gendered connotations associated with this term. And as I was looking for scholarship to help me interpret this designation, I remembered the golden rule of our field, which is that if something is interesting and worth writing about, Stephen Shapin has usually written about it, and so also in this case. So Stephen's article on the history of the soft-hard distinction in the sciences explores the historical impulse to arrange disciplines of investigation on an array and to attribute value and often resources to their position on the spectrum. For the most part of the 20th century, the natural sciences were associated with hardness due to their experimental, reproducible, and quantitative nature, whereas the social sciences, with their qualitative and theoretical focus and their emphasis on complexity, were often conceptualized as soft. According to the article, a greater openness to integrate hard and soft science approaches came with the advent of projects as key organizing categories of scientific research and funding. Projects, the article argues, force the hard sciences to reckon with the messy reality of knowledge implementation, translation, and communication, and the tricky business of real-life, uncontrollable research environments. The project nature of the new nutrition science project surely contributed to the openness of biomedically trained nutrition scientists to social and environmental scientific approaches. Nutrition is a messy problem, and the commentary on the declaration reflected a notion of 21st century nutrition as posing a particularly complex and entangled set of challenges. However, this did not mean an automatic acceptance of social and environmental science methodologies, and the Nutrition Science Project insisted repeatedly that nutrition science must remain a biological science. Initial mentions to integrated biological, social, and environmental approaches quickly gave way to vague references to social and environmental dimensions and domains, and by 2022, even tenuous appeals to the social sciences had disappeared, and the new paradigm, as Leitzman and Cannon called it, had been redefined as biological first and environmental second, eclipsing any substantial reference to social science. The historical retelling of dietetics and classical nutrition science had also never lamented a lost methodology, but rather a holistic, cosmological, and natural dimension associated with dietetics and the social and political impact imagined to accompany classical nutrition science. The writings of the New Nutrition Science Project also display what Stephen Shapin calls an under-laborer conception of social science, meaning that the social and environmental sciences were conceived as handmaidens to the natural sciences. Social and environmental science would serve the hard nutrition sciences in their moment of crisis and complement the hard labor of establishing experimentally reproducible nutritional scientific facts with the work of softening the blow when these facts had to be communicated to governments, industries, and consumers. The historical retelling also supported this supplementary conception of the social and environmental sciences to nutrition. Classical nutrition science was not in itself flawed, but had merely lost a broader, societally impactful dimension that it now needed to regain through a light sprinkling of the social and the environmental. Finally, the commentary also revealed hierarchical notions of the hard and soft science disciplinary array, with the hard science of biomedical nutrition at the top and the social and environmental sciences of nutrition in an inferior position. This is most evident in the language of the New Nutrition Science Project, which contained troubling metaphors of not only disciplinary supplementation, but colonization. Cannon and Leitzman described biomedical nutrition as extending into the domains of other sciences, advocated the incorporation of other disciplines conventionally seen to be outside of its scope, and compared the integration of social and environmental science perspectives into nutrition with the discovery, exploration, and settling of the new world of the Americas by European explorers. And then the commentary also contains subtler connotations of the distinction drawn between a biomedical nutrition science and a social and environmental one, connotations that are more implied rather than spelled out. While the historical sketch of classical nutrition science is characterized explicitly through a male-gendered lineage, the imagined gender of traditional dietetics is never named. But there are enough cues for us to draw parallels between Leitzman and Cannon's account of a holistic, cosmological dietetics that is embedded in nature and the social world, and feminist science studies scholarship on the long history of equating nature, ecology, and community with femininity. By extension, dietetics became a stand-in for a notion of the social as holistic and connected, which was contrasted with orthodox biomedical practice and knowledge production. For example, here, where dietetics is described as traditional practice and placed alongside complementary naturopathic systems of medicine, traditional Chinese or Indian medicine, and Goethe's philosophy of nature. The distinction between a biomedical and a social and environmental nutrition science, in short, also carry gendered connotations of knowledge production and medical practice that map onto hierarchical and value-laden distinctions between science and pseudoscience, science and philosophy, and orthodox and alternative medicine. So even the moderate vision of the New Nutrition Science Project of a socially and environmentally infused nutrition science never materialized. Despite several follow-up meetings and further declarations in different fora in Hyderabad in 2008 and Istanbul in 2009, a truly integrated nutrition science was never created. In 2011, a group of public health nutritionists critiqued the New Nutrition Science Project for its social light vision of nutrition. They suggested that the New Nutrition Science Project had promised to usher in a new era in which social science dimensions would now take their legitimate place within the discipline, but had never delivered on that promise. Instead, the social remained ill-defined within nutrition science, and nutrition scientists were reluctant to move outside of their, quote, disciplinary comfort zone. Today, nutritional knowledge production remains as fragmented as ever, and with new fields like critical dietetics, public health nutrition, and the split of nutrigenomics from nutrition science, fragmentation has only increased in the course of the 21st century and will likely continue to do so. The historical retellings of the history of dietetics and nutrition science articulated by the New Nutrition Science Project exacerbated this problem. They unwittingly perpetuated long-standing tensions and implicit hierarchies between various epistemic approaches to nutritional knowledge production. But I think there's also an opportunity here, and historical retellings can function as possible starting points for resolving the ongoing disciplinary and methodological crisis of nutritional knowledge production. So at this point, I confess to being engaged in a sort of retelling of my own. So in my own work, I examine the role of the social sciences, social science practitioners, methodologies, and theories in the history of nutritional knowledge production. And I'm still in the very early stages of the project, but so far it looks like the social sciences were not nearly as absent from modern nutrition science as the authors of the declaration suggested. But they were often overlooked because they tended to be women or indigenous knowledge producers whose contributions to nutritional knowledge were often dismissed as preparatory or auxiliary, technical or cultural work to the real science. To draw on yet another important piece of scholarship by Stephen Shapin, social scientists in many ways were the invisible technicians of nutrition science. Gaining a better understanding of the contributions of the social sciences to nutrition might help us do away with some of the fallacies created by the New Nutrition Science Project's retellings, that the social sciences played virtually no role in modern nutrition science, and that all the successes of classical nutrition science must therefore be attributed to biomedical nutrition. While the history of the nutritional social sciences holds many cautionary tales, it can also be a source of inspiration for true interdisciplinary collaboration. At the very least, it suggests that the social sciences do not need to be added to biomedical nutrition science from scratch. Nuanced, deeply researched histories that hold historical complexity and don't lend themselves easily to instrumental retellings of historical change and continuity, like Eating and Being, are important antidotes to transactional tales that mistake current essentializing disciplinary dichotomies for historical periodization. I think this book should be required reading not just in history of science and food history courses or even history courses, but in food science courses, in public health nutrition, and in the nutrition sciences. And I sincerely hope that the next declaration of whatever place, which will certainly come, will draw on the book and will take a more nuanced approach to the lessons of history. Thank you very much.
I was wondering during your talk how you would allocate within this the addiction to sugar, and also which has now been proven to be inherited as well. How in the sphere of us, our generation, who now have not only an inherited addiction to sugar, but also additional by the fact that within our young lives we've had a lot of it. Do you think this will alter our possibility of being able to think of a world that deals with sugar differently? So not just from the point of view of culturally and through external factors how sugar has been proposed to us, but how within this fits our inherent physiological predisposition for addiction to sugar. Thank you.
Thank you for the incredible presentations, both very informative and gave a lot of food for thought, quite literally and, of course, metaphorically. I also have an additional question for La Professoressa. I work here in the food lab, and we work with a lot of alternative sugars, is what we would call them, so alternative sources of sweetness. And I'm curious if in your research you have encountered differing moral values attached to different sources of sugar. When we think about the exploitation and production of sugarcane in mostly southern hemisphere, central area, we think about the exploitation of labor, people, land grabbing. But I was talking to my friend here, Esme, who asked me if I had ever smelled beet sugar production and the smellscape that it causes to local communities. And so I'm curious to know that if in your research you've found certain value, moral, ethical lightness or darkness associated with the variety of sugar sources. Stevia plants coming mostly from the tropics, of course, so there's that dynamic of exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. Lisa, can I... So I was intrigued by your by the narrative structure of your talk, like how your retelling and your retelling of your retelling engages with the nutritionism paradigm. Like on the one side, it looked like this new nutrition project was a rhetorical device, or a kind of dialectical twists in the nutritionism, reductionism. But in the end, you said that the social sciences were actually there in the nutritionism, in the making of the nutritionism kind of reductionism. I'm sorry about all the isms, but they are there. So what is your position, like if historiographically, with respect to the nutritionism paradigm? I'm referring first to screenies.
A little question for Ilaria. I want to know if you consider in your research and about the conflict, saccharophilia, saccharophobia, the fact that in some subculture, recent, sugar has also the role of a metaphor of drugs. White sugar, brown sugar. So you show a photo with sugar and a spoon. So perhaps there is something like that.
So it's a comment and an observation. The comment is this, and I would like to know your opinion, that this free from idea just confirms, in my opinion, that sugar is still, as Bart said in the 60s, a category of the world. Not only because it's not a real decline if we try to substitute it in so many different ways, and also because sugar goes beyond calories and as many other meanings. And then the follow-up question to the Kiva ones is that I'm curious about your idea or your opinion about today's food communication of free from, and specifically if, in your opinion, there are still social and moral issues at stake, and to be more specifically, so to change a little bit the question if there are still gender issues at stake. So, as they were very common in most of the food communication about sugar, industrial food, helping housewives, or campaign anti-sugar of the 70s were very much embedded with gender issues. Thank you.
2 questions for you. For Ilaria, it's about a specific period, mid-80s and 90s. It's really, in my opinion, important period during which sugar, the history of sugar, was totally reshaped by the idea of body, in the sense of beauty, what is beauty and what is not beauty. I was wondering if we can approach this period with the word dissonance, in the sense that from one hand there are top models trying to promote sugar, Diet Coke and many other. On the other, McDonald's proposing other typology of food. And on the screen there is this dissonance, and the perception of this dissonance probably was at the base of problems, health problem, or way of approaching a good and health way of eating. It's in my opinion, a really turning point period, and I would like to ask you if from a semiotic point of view this has some implication. And as regards Lisa's paper, I'm really interested in asking you how you approach in analyzing categories during your research on the field. And I mean, it's on one hand a history of a group, a research group, and how this group reworked a specific idea of good eating or nutrition, etc., etc. As you said, was is a really heterogeneous group, so with many people, many also educations, many scientific paths. I was wondering if, as a historian, when you meet some explicit and implicit hierarchies and words, such as hard and soft, or the construction of a narrative about food, how you approach these categories. At the beginning of your talk, you said you mentioned the subjectivity, history of science, education, etc., etc. So it's something only about the individual. It's something about a specific and more larger idea of science. How you analyze and attribute a meaning to categories you found during the research. I don't know if it's clear on my question. I hope.
Yes. Yes, I've noted all the questions, but okay. Okay, so starting from the first question about... scusa Nicola, c'era domanda tua? Okay. About the consequences on the physiology, if I well understood, okay, I don't know actually, but maybe I can say something about the aesthetic and sensorial consequences, because what I've tried to say is that even there's no sugar, there's a lot of sweetness, maybe more than before, because there are lots of type of sweet taste is very differentiated, and so there is very spread new sweetness. I don't know what Maddalena thinks about the sweetness. So we can develop different level of perception, also acquiring, learning to distinguish, for instance, different sweeteners. So stevia is good, aspartame is less good, and vice versa, and so on, okay? So something, maybe consequences on the side of perception of taste, on physiology, actually, I don't know. Regarding the second question about the exploitation and the political, economical values of alternatives, if I understood well, okay. Actually, I haven't found it yet in my research because it is at the beginning, but I'm quite sure that there are also these kind of implications, and that they also can be used also by brands to put in value their positioning, like in the organic market, this idea of the defense of communities, of local communities, is very used. So I'm quite sure I will find it. So thank you very much for the idea. For Gianfranco, drug, the idea of drug that is connected to the addiction is the starting point of demonization of sugar. Sugar is bad because it is a drug. I think it's a new form of retelling the ancient idea of sugar like pharmacon. So too much sugar is poisonous, so everything returns. For Maddalena, of course, I totally agree with the idea of sugar time. Of course, it's like in the 50s. It's a different articulation of sugar time, but it's always sugar time. I had to go very, very fast, but I think that this kind of free-from products and sugar-free products was produced to allow people to enjoy the sugar time in this dietetic, following also dietetic prescription, so yes. About the problem, the issue of the gender in the advertising of dietetic and sugar-free and free-from product of 60s, 70s, it was very, very clear that was this women-targeted advertisement. I think that today is less clear, is less gender-oriented, but I haven't explored this field, this aspect of the question, so I will do it for sure. And as regards the Gabriele, yes, of course, there's a problem of models of the body. George Vigarello, in his French historian who wrote this book on the history of fat, explains very well that long before the models of the 80s, at the end of the 19th century, a new idea of body started to spread. That was the body that has to be subject to quantitative measures of the quantity of fats and of the size of the body. So the detractors of sugar in the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century and the 20th century, also 19th century, sorry, and 20th century, of course, were also in advising, especially women, that too much sugar would affect their body size. So the problem of the models, of the top models of the 90s has its roots in, yes, a century before. Yes.
On nutritionism, so Yeah, I think, so historiographically, I think there's no doubt that nutritionism is, rightly been receiving a lot of attention, and that it constitutes a really powerful paradigm of relating to food, and essentially, I'm very much also considering myself part of that historiography of explaining the rise of nutritionism and that powerful position. And at the same time, I think, especially sort of within sort of global health histories, there is this, because there's sort of an equating of nutrition with social medicine. And so there was, I think, a focus, especially in the 20th century, on sort of projects that, nutritional projects that were taking place, that were conducted by medics in medical settings, in global health settings. And when I was doing the research for the book, I just noticed that often in these sort of big global health nutrition projects, there were social scientists attached to the projects as well. And I think that may not necessarily mean that social scientists, so I think I'm just interested in, it's more a historical question of what happened there, right? So I do think it's probably a little bit of a blind spot I had. So I'm just curious about, were they sort of written out, or what happened there? So, and I think it's probably, or at least what I'm seeing is that it's both, you can look at them as both sort of contributing to mainstream nutritionist projects, but also undermining them a little bit. So it's a question, to what extent were they participating in this, and in some ways even kind of helping the rise of nutritionism as a paradigm, and to what extent were they resisting or undermining it. I think in this kind of new nutrition science project, Retelling, it just struck me that there's sort of it amounts to a kind of deficit narrative of the history of nutrition. So we've never been social, and so now we need to add the social, and so kind of, if there are lessons to be learned from projects that were already interdisciplinary, I just think it's interesting to look at them. And this may also be because I'm currently very much sort of in the present also having to deal with interdisciplinarity, and I'm involved into interdisciplinary projects, which are very challenging, but I think very worth doing. And that is probably also the context for your question. So if I understood correctly, you were asking whether the sort of the retellings and the sort of these designations of hard and soft were something that I attribute to just kind of individuals like Cannon and Leitzman, or whether this is something that is more a broader phenomenon, did I?
Yeah, in the sense, from a methodological and historiographical point of view, if you have a found on the table, a source on the table, I think you have many possibilities. You can say, okay, this is only the voice of a person involved in the group, or on the contrary is something about a debate or a public debate, or more wider if is something about an academic hierarchy, etc., etc. So there are different levels. From an historical point of view, I think it's really interesting to know how you approach this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's on the one hand, it's kind of working, distinguishing between, my actors categories and my analytical categories, and sort of seeing what I find the actors using. I think, in this case, it's, it really is both. It's, I think on the one hand, the individuals are very important in this case, but the individuals themselves are, I've traced them also kind of within their very particular kind of educational and scientific contexts, and then, there's sort of the role of institutions that they're attached to, that they're founding. And I think, in this case, it's, there's obviously, there is heterogeneity in this group and in general, but I think what's really interesting to me to get at is this sort of, when it becomes a culture, when it becomes part of a culture, when it becomes subconscious, and therefore is, as soon as you're kind of a part of that community, that becomes part of your worldview and your vocabulary, and you absorb it, and it's something that, as I said, I'm wrestling with at the moment, because I'm kind of involved in interdisciplinary work, and it's present in structures of funding or grant applications, or so I do think there is a, and it's helpful to have these analyses of like, what does it mean when, I don't think they necessarily use the vocabulary of hard and soft as often. I mean, this was one of two instances where they explicitly said it, but I do think there's much of it, you can see it kind of underlying their thinking, and there is a hierarchical thinking and a sort of, when I initially encountered this example, I was quite excited, and I thought, okay, this is an example of, where there's an openness to interdisciplinarity and where this works well. And then you sort of, I think underneath it is, there's still quite a hostility to the actual methodologies of these fields, or a skepticism at least. And it's more that, the nutrition sciences are now just going to be different from now on, because they'll be taking the social and the environmental into account.